Appreciate y'all, worship team. Thank you very much. Cool. So, I hope you're not tired of hearing me talk yet. If you are, sorry. You're stuck with me again. So again, for those of you who may not know me, my name's Kyle. And if you know me pretty well, you know that I'm a hardcore Mavs fan. Okay, I know baseball and football is kind of our Texan thing that everyone enjoys, but I don't really care about baseball and football that much. I care about basketball, and so I'm sure half of the room is going to tune out the rest of the sermon because of that. But I love the Mavs. As much as it hurts me to love the Mavs because they're having a little rough time right now. They won a championship back in 2011, which I loved every bit of that, and it was just so great. But progressively, the team has kind of had a rocky time in the league, and so it makes it kind of hard to watch a Mavs game when you know kind of what the outcome is. It starts off like when the championship was going on, like it was really exciting to watch them, and you're like, man, they're going to win every game, they're unstoppable. And then progressively, just things would be happening that caused me to start losing faith in the team a little bit. I mean, I still love the team, and I'll always root for them. But I start losing a little bit of faith that they're even going to come out with a victory at some point. And they have this thing where they do really bad the first quarter, and then they spend the entire game trying to come back, and it looks like they might get it, and it doesn't work out. I watched some of the games over at the house with JT, and he's always super encouraging. He's like, "Oh wow, they're doing really well," and I just like, just hang on, just watch. They're not going to do great. And most of the time I'm right, but I always forget. I tend to forget that there's a guy on the team, this 7-foot-tall German guy who's been in the league for 20 years. His name's Dirk Nowitzki. Don't know if anyone's heard of that name before. But the dude has proven himself to be an all-star time after time after time. And he's proven to be able to put the team on his back and take the team to victory. And I tend to, whenever I'm watching these games, I'm seeing them lose, and I just see all these negative things that are happening. I start losing faith, like this team's not going to do anything. Like this, there's no way they can come out with this victory here. But then here comes our boy Dirk, and he comes out and just drains a couple threes, and that's a three-pointer for people who don't know what that is, sorry. And just brings the team right back into the game, and then we get the victory. And so I tend to have a lack of faith that this team's going to win, but then even though I know that Dirk has proven himself over and over again, that's the thing, Dirk has proven himself many times, and I've seen it live too. I've been there multiple times watching this happen. This guy's an all-star. He's going to be a Hall of Famer. No one cares about this stuff, I know, I'm sorry. That's just me, but he has proven himself over and over again. I mean, he led his whole team to the championship in 2011. He still proves himself, even though he's played for 20 years. He's super old now, but he has proven himself regardless. And so, but that's where I get in this problem, where I start lacking faith that this team's going to win, even though he has proven that he's capable of leading this team to victory. Y'all follow me? And so we're looking at a story today about this guy who is really having this struggle with God. He has a trust problem. He has a faith problem. He has a real lack of faith. And I want us to look at this and see what we do with that. What do we do with this when we have this situation of a lack of faith? And you all know what a lack of faith is. You don't really have trust, or you don't have the confidence that something's going to happen, or you don't have the confidence that someone is going to come through for you, or anything like that. Think of different examples of ways that you've had lack of faith in your life. But we're going to look at it today of how this applies in our walks with Christ. And so if you have your Bibles, turn to the book of Judges. We're going old school, Old Testament today, all right? So turn to the book of Judges chapter 6. And so as you're turning there, just some information about like the Bible and stuff. So the Bible is made up of a few different literary styles. And one big chunk of the Bible, about 43% of the Bible, is made up of a literary style called narrative. You know what narrative is? It's essentially storytelling. And a big reason that the Bible is told a lot in narrative is because everyone loves a story. I mean, everybody really enjoys stories, and stories help us understand, helps us be able to see points that we can pull out of it. We can relate to certain characters, different things like that. And so we're looking at a narrative today in Judges chapter 6. And if you know anything about the book of Judges, in the Old Testament in general, the Old Testament is following this people group, right? This people group of Israel. I'm sure you've heard of them before, okay? So Israel is the main kind of people group that we're following in the Old Testament. They're God's chosen people set apart to represent God on the earth, and so that others may see God through their lives. But Israel has a real up and down relationship with God. Sometimes they're killing killing it, they're doing an awesome job, and then sometimes they are way not killing it, and they're doing terrible, right? And so we get into the book of Judges, and what happens in this place is Israel gets sucked into this very toxic routine and this cycle of following God and then turning away from God. And what happens, and you'll read this all throughout the book of Judges, it even sets it up at the beginning of Judges, where it starts off, Israel is at peace with God, they're walking with God, doing what they need to be doing, but then something happens and they turn away from God. And when they turn away from God, and you'll see it in the Bible, it will talk, when it's written in there, it says that Israel once again did what was evil in the Lord's sight. And when that happens, the next part of that cycle is God hands them over to their enemies. He says, you want to disobey me? You want to try to do this on your own? Fine, go for it. See how that works for you. And he hands them over to an enemy who then takes over them. And then they get in that situation, and it's not really good. They don't like it, and they realize that they need God's help, and so they cry out to God. That's the next step in the cycle. They cry out to God, and then God sends them a judge. That's why we get the name of Judges from this, is God sends a judge, an individual who will come in and deliver these people from their captivity, deliver them from whatever they're dealing with, and ultimately to bring them back to where they can be at peace with God and be walking with God again. But then the next chapter starts, and the cycle starts all over again. Okay, and so we're picking up here in chapter 6, and we're following a guy named Gideon. Everybody say Gideon. Gideon. So Gideon, I'm sure you've heard of this story. He's one of the most famous judges that we talk about. And so we're going to look at this guy named Gideon, picking up in chapter 6. And so this is Judges chapter 6. I'm going to start off in verses 1 through 2. And this sets up our story here. Chapter 6, verse 1 says, the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. Okay, you see this cycle starting all over again. They once again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. And the Lord gave them into the hand of Midian for 7 years. In verse 2, and the hand of Midian overpowered Israel, and because of Midian, the people of Israel made for themselves the dens that are in the mountains and the caves and the strongholds. I'll keep reading through verse 3. For whenever the Israelites planted crops, the Midianites and the Amalekites and the people of the east would come up against them. And they would encamp against them and devour their produce of the land as far as Gaza, and leave no sustenance in Israel, and no sheep or ox or donkey. And so, as we're picking up here, again, Israel does what's evil in the Lord's sight, so God hands them over to their enemies. In this case, the enemy is Midian and the Midianites. And what's happening here, every time they're planting crops, and their livelihood is they're living off of that stuff. The Midianites and this other group comes in and just takes all that stuff away from them. They just completely wipe that stuff out. And that leads them in what they're saying in verse 2. It says that they made for themselves dens that are in mountains and caves and strongholds. Israel just starts hiding in all these places, hiding from the Midianites because of how terrible they are and what they're doing to Israel. Okay, and so that's where we're picking up. That's what we're dealing with here. And so, again, as the cycle continues, Israel gets in this situation. It's a terrible situation. So they cry out to God. God hears them, and he's about to raise up a judge who's going to deliver them from the enemy. All right? Y'all following me? Cool. All right, so we're going to pick up. We're going to jump ahead. And we're going to do, just a side note, we're going to kind of jump around this story a bit. I really encourage you to go home and read the full story to get a really full picture of what's going on here. But we're going to pick up here in verse 11. And so God's preparing this judge who's going to rescue Israel. All right. And verse 11 says, now the angel of the Lord came and sat under the terebinth at Ophrah, which belonged to Joash the Abizarite, while his son Gideon was beating out wheat in the winepress to hide it from the Midianites. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him, and he said to him, the Lord is with you, O mighty man of valor. Okay. And so as we pick up to see who is this judge, who is this guy who's going to deliver Israel, we think this should be a mighty, and he addresses him as a mighty warrior. And what I would think, we don't see this warrior, what you would figure a warrior would be doing. He's not out wrestling a bear or anything super hardcore. What is Gideon doing? What is he doing? He's hiding. And he's hiding from the Midianites. He's doing this stuff with the wheat. He's getting his food and everything prepared for it, but he's in hiding. He's hiding from these people. Okay, so that's your first note that you see about Gideon. Gideon's not someone who's has no fear or anything like that. He has fear. He's very fearful of the Midianites, and he's doing this stuff in hiding. And the angel shows up to him, and he addresses him, and he says, "Mighty warrior, the Lord is with you." And look at Gideon's response here in verse 13. Gideon replies in verse 13, so Gideon said to him, well, please, sir, if the Lord is with us, why then has all this happened to us? And where are all the wonderful deeds that our father recounted to us, saying, did not the Lord bring us up from Egypt? But now the Lord has forsaken us and given us into the hand of Midian. Okay, so the angel addresses him. He says, hey, Lord is with you. God's going to do something awesome in your life. And Gideon's response is, well, is he? Is he really with us? And why is Gideon feeling this way? This is your first picture of Gideon's lack of faith. When he addresses, he says, hey, God is with you. Gideon's like, well, I don't really think so. It doesn't really seem like it. Okay? And for many, and that might be how some of us are feeling right now. It says, well, if God is really with us, and you hear this all the time. You come to church, everyone says, hey, God's with you. God's with you. Super encouraging words. But a lot of times you may be feeling, well, if he's with us, then why is this happening? If God's with me, then why is he letting me go through this? If God's with me, then why is the world the way it is? If God's really with us, and you just have this thing where you look at these things and you realize it just doesn't feel like God's with you. All right? And some of you in this room may be feeling that way this morning. You might feel like, well, I don't really feel like God's with me right now. All right? You're kind of questioning, you're uncertain of that. And that brings up our first point in dealing with a lack of faith. The first thing we need to know about a lack of faith is it reflects a sinful perspective. Again, realize why Gideon and the Israelites are in this situation. Why are they held captive by Midian? Why are they facing these hardships and these persecutions? Why is that happening? It's not because God's, it's anything bad that God did. It's the reason that they're in the situation is a result of their sin. Are y'all following me? Okay, so Gideon's question is like, oh, I don't know why it doesn't feel like I can't feel God right now. It doesn't really seem like God's here. But the reason he's in that situation is because it's a result of their sin. Okay, and so that's the first thing about having a lack of faith. It reflects a sinful perspective. When you're focusing on your sin, you're focusing on those things, you're not going to be able to see God for who he is. Are y'all following me? Because that's the thing with sin, is sin blinds us. Sin separates us from God, and it puts this huge wall in between us and him. And we question, we're like, well, I really don't feel God moving in my life. That's because there's this big gaping wall that's separating you from him, right? And so that's why Gideon has this lack of faith to begin with, is because it's a result of the sin that's happened in Israel, all right? And so for some of us in here, you may, again, just dealing with the thing where it feels like this doesn't seem like God's present in your life. You don't really see him moving, or it just seems like a lot of really negative things are happening. It's not that, the problem is never with God, and that's the first thing people say, well, God's just a jerk, and I don't really want to worship somebody who's going to do that. The problem is never with God. The problem is always with us, and it's always about our perspective on what we're focusing on. And if we're not feeling God, if we're not seeing God moving in our lives, it's not that God's just sitting up there bored playing a video game or something. It's because of our perspective. It's what we are choosing to focus on. All right? And so how do you expect to encounter God's presence? And how do you expect to encounter his peace and have confidence in that if you have this huge wall that's separating you from him with your sin? Okay? And so that's where we're going on with Gideon here. He's dealing with this sin problem in Israel, and the angel tells him, hey, God's with you. He's like, well, it doesn't really seem like it. There's a lack of faith, and it's a result of that sinful perspective. We pick up in verse 14, and so the angel replies to him. In verse 14 it says, the Lord turned to Gideon, and the Lord said, go in this might of yours and save Israel from the hand of Midian. Do I not send you? Verse 15 says, and he said to him, Gideon replies, please, Lord, how can I save Israel? Behold, my clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my father's house. Okay, and I'll go ahead and read verse 16. And the Lord said to him, but I will be with you, and you shall strike the Midianites as one man. And so God gives him this mission, this huge task. And what is Gideon's response? Is this like I'm pumped, I'm ready, this is awesome, thank you so much for this opportunity, I'm so excited about this? Is that his response? Everyone shake your head. No, that's not his response. What is his response? Well, why me? Are you sure you got the right guy? Have you seen me? Have you seen my track record? Do you see how small I am? I'm the smallest in my family, youngest in my family. My family is the smallest in Israel. I mean, I don't know I think you chose the wrong guy here. I think you're mistaken, right? And so that sounds, again, he's been addressed as a mighty warrior. And this mighty warrior, first of all, is fearful. There's a lack of faith. And he's like, well, I don't really know how God can use me. I'm just super weak and insignificant. But what's God's response to him? In verse 16, notice God doesn't say like, oh, no, man, you're great. Like, you just need to work out a little bit more and maybe we'll get somewhere. God's response, the way he reassures Gideon is by saying what? I will be with you, right? The way he reassures Gideon, saying, this is what you need in order to do this task. It's not about your strength. It's not about your stature. It's not about the fact that you can wrestle a bear. It's not about any of that stuff. what you need in order to do this task is my presence. And he says, I'm with you, and that's all you need, right? But we like to do this all the time. We like to come up with all these excuses on why God can't use us. Whether we're sitting in our jobs and we see people who we know God's calling us to share the gospel with them, and you're like, well, no, God, I don't really know. We start coming up with these excuses. Well, they're in their lunch right now. I don't really want to mess with their lunchtime. We start using all these lame excuses. And what we see here, when Gideon throws his excuse at God, God's not having any of it. He says, your excuses are nothing. All you need is me. You just need me there, and you'll have all that you need in that. And so God makes it very clear that there's no excuse that's going to keep him from doing his work. He reassures him by saying, I'm with you. That's all you need. And so we pick up in verse 17. That should be enough, right? If God's with me, then I can do anything, right? That should be really encouraging. Verse 17, Gideon, and he said to him, Gideon says, he replies, well, if I have found favor in your eyes, then show me a sign that it is you who speak with me, okay? And so what is Gideon doing here? He's still really hesitant. He still has this lack of faith. Well, I'm not really. Are you really sure? Just so I know that you are who you say you are. Let me get some kind of proof here, right? I don't know if you've ever tried to use your card somewhere, like your debit card or something, and then sometimes they'll ask you for your ID, right? I'm thinking, well, why do you need my ID? That's not really important. But they see the name on the card, and they want to make sure that the name on the card matches who I am, right? And they want proof that I am who I say I am, right? And that's what Gideon's asking for here. I want some proof. I want you to show me that you are who you say you are. Give me some kind of sign. He's not trusting God at his word. He's not trusting that God is who he says he is. He wants some signs here. He wants some evidence. And that leads us to our second point, dealing with lack of faith. When you have a lack of faith, that will result in doubt and uncertainty and in fear. Okay, when you have a lack of faith in something, that then results. It produces these actions of doubt. The reason you doubt people is because you don't really trust that they are who they say they are. Right? This is why Gideon is doubting God right now. He has this doubt because of his lack of faith. Okay, and so the source of this doubt and this uncertainty and the fear we experience is a result of us not trusting in God. Because when God's with us and he is in control of our lives, that is the ultimate place where we will have peace and joy that's promised to us. God's presence does that. It's so overwhelming that it draws out all fear, all worry, all uncertainty. But when we're on our own and we have that lack of faith that God really is that kind of person, that God really is like that, that's where you start seeing these doubts and these uncertainties come in. When you start having those fear and those worries and those stress and all of that stuff, you're not trusting in God's presence being enough for you. All right? You start doubting that. And so he asked God for a sign. Give me some kind of sign. Just show me that you are who you say you are. Even though God has already done that tremendously in Israel's past, and even just in this conversation has already shown up and said, hey, I'm pretty important here. Like, trust me. Gideon is still uncertain. And the thing is, the whole thing about trusting God is a complete act of faith. Right? You're putting your trust, and for us especially, is we're putting our trust in someone that we haven't physically seen with our own eyes. We are taking a leap of faith a lot of times when God calls us to do something and it makes no sense to us. So it requires us letting go of our logic and what makes sense to us and relying on him and trusting that he knows better than us. That's what trusting in God really looks like. And that's not comfortable for us. And that's why we start questioning and start doubting the way that Gideon is here. But notice in verse 21, so what happens if you keep reading in this, so Gideon prepares this offering thing. And so this is how he wants his sign. He presents this offering thing before this angel here, and he wants some kind of sign within this that's going to show him that he is who he says he is. And in verse 21, if you can follow there, it says, then the angel of the Lord reached out the tip of his staff that was in his hand and touched the meat of this offering that's here in the unleavened cakes. And fire sprang up from the rock and consumed the meat and the unleavened cakes, and the angel of the Lord vanished from his sight. I'm pretty convinced as I'm reading this. I'm like, well, okay, that's enough reason for me to trust you. Cool. That's big thing of fire that just comes out of nowhere. That would convince me at least. I don't know. But what's cool about when you read this is when Gideon asks for a sign, God doesn't say like, oh, no, forget it. Like, I'm done now. God gives him the proof. Are y'all following me? God gives him the proof. He shows him why you can trust him. That's what's so great about God is he doesn't just tell us to trust him without giving us a reason to. Does that make sense? There's been times where I'm sure there's people that say, hey, trust me. And you're like, I'm not going to trust you. I have no reason to trust you. But this is, I think of like with, and most of the time when parents buy their kids cars, right? what's the first car that they normally will buy their child? Is it a nice fancy convertible thing? Some parents might, I don't know. But most parents, when you buy their kids a car, what do they normally buy them? Yeah, a junker. Yeah, it's a car that just is probably barely running. And why do they do that? They want to know, if I can trust you to take care of this car, if I can trust you to take care of this thing that's falling apart, if I can trust you in that car, then that means that I can trust you and I can trust you to get another car that's better and better quality. They're not just going to buy this big fancy car, and if you haven't proven that you can trust them, that's a side note, youth, right? So if you want a car, that's how you do it, right? So give them a reason that you can trust them, right? And that's what that whole thing is. And that's what's great about God, is God gives us plenty of reasons, reason after reason, opportunity after opportunity of God showing up and giving us reasons of why you can trust Him, right? So let's keep going. Verse 25. Okay, so that same night, this is after what just happened here with the offering and everything, God has proven Himself to Gideon, and so Gideon should be ready to go to do this, all right? We pick up in verse 25. This is Gideon's first mission, all right? Verse 25 says, "That night the Lord said to him, 'Take your father's bull and the second bull, 7 years old, and pull down the altar of Baal that your father has, and cut down the Asherah that is beside it. And build an altar to the Lord your God on the top of the stronghold here, with stones laid in due order. Then take the second bull, offer it as a burnt offering with the wood of the Asherah that you cut down.'" In verse 27, so that's the mission. God is sending Gideon to tear down these idols, these things, which is the main reason of why Israel's in the situation they're in, is a result of these idols that they were worshiping instead of God. And so his first task is, go tear this down, go take this stuff down, right? So that's the task. In verse 27, here's Gideon. "So Gideon took 10 men of his servants and did as the Lord had told him, but because he was too afraid of his family and the men of the town to do it by day, he did it by night." Once again, we're seeing another way that Gideon is lacking the faith to trust in God, having the confidence to trust God. The first thing you see that in is Gideon doesn't go out there on his own, walking with the strength of the Lord. He's not doing that on his own. He has to have 10 little friends to go with him to get this done. Right? He's putting his confidence in numbers. He can't do this on his own. He's too scared to do it on his own. He's too fearful and uncertain to do it on his own. So he needs 10 other guys to help him out with it. Y'all notice that? Okay, so he's putting his confidence in numbers. But then also, when does he do it? Does he do it in broad daylight where everyone can see it happening? Yeah, shake your head. No, he does it. He does it at nighttime. It says, but because Gideon was afraid. He was too afraid of his family, too afraid of everyone else. So he has to do it at night. Again, you're seeing just one after the other, these reasons of just these examples of the way that Gideon is not trusting God. Even though God has already proven Himself and proven His power and just all that He can do, Gideon is still he has this lack of faith. And so that story happens and some things follow along with that. And again, I encourage you to go back and read this, but for the sake of time, we're going to jump ahead to verse 33 here. And so in verse 33... once again, God shows up for Gideon. Again, remember the Midianites are the opposition that Israel is dealing with right now. This huge army. And if you go on and read throughout the story, there's an example that they use to kind of give you a picture of how big the Midianite army is. And it says just the camels that they rode on outnumbered the sand on the seashore. That kind of gives you a picture of the number of people that we're dealing with, the enemy that you're dealing with. Okay. And so verse 33. They show up again, ready to attack and ready to intimidate Israel. Verse 33 says, "Now all the Midianites and the Amalekites and the people of the east came together, and they crossed the Jordan and encamped in the valley of Jezreel. But the Spirit of the Lord clothed Gideon, and he sounded the trumpet, and the Bezerites were called out to follow him. And he sent messengers throughout all of Manasseh, and they too were called out to follow him. And he sent messengers to Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali, and they went up to meet him." And so the opposition shows up. This huge, ridiculous army shows up to intimidate Israel. And God shows up in Gideon's life. He fills him with His Spirit, clothes him in His Spirit. That's a really cool picture of God clothing him in His Spirit, just empowering him to have the confidence to confront this army that's coming to oppose Israel. Okay, y'all following that? And you see, and through God's strength, He builds this huge support system. These groups all come together. These groups are united to stand against this opposition. Do you think that that's enough reason for Gideon to trust God? Do you think he's going to do it? No. Let's keep going. Verse 36. Gideon's still uncertain. Then Gideon said to God, "If you will save Israel by my hand, as you have said, behold, I am laying a fleece of wool on the threshing floor. If there is dew on the fleece alone, and it is dry on all the ground, then I shall know that you will save Israel by my hand, as you have said." He's still not trusting God's word, trusting that God has given him this task. God is there. He is present. He is at work. Gideon still wants some more proof, okay? And so he gets this thing called this fleece. And if you know what a fleece is, it's like what comes off of a sheep, the wool on a sheep. They probably used it for like clothes and maybe like a rug in their house. I don't know. So they use that. And he says, all right, so I want this big sign that you are going to do this. He's already received enough proof, but yet Gideon is still asking for it. And he's still testing God, still not willing to trust God with all that he is. And he lays this fleece out on the ground outside, and he says, all right, so here's my proof. Here's how I know for sure. If the fleece, and then you know what happens in the morning where there's dew on the ground, right? And so he says, all right, so if this is really going to happen, if you're going to lead us to victory, this is all going to be awesome, then I'm going to put this fleece on the ground, and when I wake up in the morning, please let the fleece be wet with all of the dew and the ground all around it dry. Okay, that's the picture of the sign that he's asking for. And 38. And it was so, when he rose early the next morning and squeezed the fleece, he wrung enough dew from the fleece to fill a bowl with water. And so God shows up once again. Here's another reason you can trust me, okay? You're asking for all these ridiculous signs, even though I've already proven it to you, but here's another reason on top of that of why you can trust me. It happens exactly as Gideon asked, right? He's wringing this out into a bowl, just seeing all this evidence of God answering that prayer, showing him why you can trust him. Is that enough? You think you trust him? Let's keep going. Verse 39. Then Gideon said to God, "Let not your anger burn against me. Let me speak just once more." Think of I think when I was a kid, I would be pestering my mom over and over and over and over, like asking for something. And then I've just worn her out. And then I realized that I've worn her out, and I still actually have something to ask her for. It's like, okay, just please don't yell at me, don't beat me, just let me just ask one more thing. So he's approaching this really hesitantly and just fearful because he knows what he's doing. And again, he asks. So he says, verse 39. So he says, "Let not your anger burn against me. Let me speak just once more. Please let me test just once more with the fleece. Please let it be dry on the fleece only, and all the ground let there be dew." So now he's flipping it, saying, all right, so now let the fleece stay dry and all the ground around it be wet. And this is just insane. This guy, what else does he need? What more proof do you need that God is who he says he is, that God is capable of using you and strengthening you? What more do you need in order to trust him? And this is insane. And this brings up a point where, let's go ahead and read this real quick. In verse 40, so Gideon's asking for another sign, and what does God do? Verse 40, God did so that night, and it was dry on the fleece only, and all the ground there was dew. And this is what's incredible, and what I'm so thankful for, is God is so incredibly patient, right? If this were me, I would have given up a long stinking time ago, right? I'd sub for Forney School District, and there was one day I got stuck with a kindergarten class, and Lord have mercy, oh my gosh, I'm just always reminded when I get in those situations, yes, thank you, Lord, for not calling me to children's ministry. That's not where my giftedness is one bit. But I'm dealing with these kids, and they're running around like crazy. I say, okay, sit down, do your work. And so they sit down, I turn around, and then they get up, and they start running around again. I say, okay, sit down, do your work. They do it again. I'm like, sit down. I start yelling at them, right? It's just insane. It's just ridiculous. My patience level with them is just non-existent. And like I said, if this were me, I would have given up on Gideon a long time ago. After the first time he questioned me, like, oh, if you don't want to trust me, then whatever, that's your problem. I'll go do my own thing now, right? But that's not how God is at all. And I'm so thankful for that because we are just as stubborn, we are just as dumb as Gideon is, all right? We do this on a daily basis. We are constantly doubting God. We're constantly not trusting. We're constantly turning away from God and chasing after sin, all these things, and yet God remains patient. He remains faithful. And that's something I'm incredibly thankful for. And 2 Peter talks about God's patience. He says, God is patient, not wanting anyone to perish, but for all to come to repentance. That's his desire. And that's the thing. God doesn't have to wait. I mean, he has every right to punish us right now because that's what we deserve. And yet he remains patient because he wants everyone to come in repentance and to know him for who he is and to have this relationship with him. That's his desire for everyone to do that. Okay? And so he remains patient. And he continues to give Gideon more and more reasons of why you can trust him. And so we pick up in chapter 7 now. So Gideon has tested God, and he has tested God, and he has tested God over and over and over and over. And now what's cool in chapter 7 is God's going to flip it, all right? So Gideon has been asking this whole time, God, I just want to make sure that you're the real deal before I really go out and risk my life here. I want to make sure that you're good, right? And he's just trying to make sure that he's real and he's the real deal. And now God's going to step in. He says, all right, you've tested me. That's been fun. We've had some laughs. That's great. Now I want to know if you're the real deal. We pick up in chapter 7. So Gideon and all the people who were with him rose early and encamped beside the spring of Harod. And the camp of Midian was north of them, but the hill of Moreh in the valley, or by the hill of Moreh in the valley. Then the Lord said to Gideon, here's his test. The people with you are too many for me to give the Midianites into your hand, lest Israel boast over me, saying, my own hand has saved me. What God's saying, you got a big old army here. And I don't want y'all to think for 1 second that y'all were the one responsible for this victory. Okay, I don't want you to brag. I don't want you to have any reason to brag about that. I want it to be evident that I did this. Okay, so it says you got too many people in your army here. So verse 3. Now therefore proclaim in the ears of the people, saying, whoever is fearful and trembling, let him return home and hurry away from Mount Gilead. Then 22,000 of the people returned, and 10,000 remained. So he had a big old army, about 32,000 people. And God says, that's quite a bit. And I don't want y'all to, for 1 second, to think that y'all won this victory. And so I'm going to need you to trim this army down a bit. All right? And so he says, anyone who just wants to go sleep in their own bed tonight, which would probably be me, anyone who's just really fearful, doesn't want to go take this on, y'all go ahead and go home. Right? And so this is where you really see these warriors. And so they all, 22,000, that's over half of the army leaves. So 10,000 are left. And again, remember how big the Midianite army is. The camels that they rode on are just as numerous as the sand on the seashore. That's insane. And yet God's saying, no, we need less people to do this. All right? And so they're left with less than half of what they started with. Okay? So that's the first test. And then he keeps going. Verse 4. Then the Lord said to Gideon, no, the people are still too many. Take them down to the water, and I will test them for you there. And anyone of whom I say to you, this one shall go with you, shall go with you. And anyone of whom I say to you, this one shall not go with you, shall not go. And so he gives them this test on, he says, bring them down to the water and kind of determine how they drink the water, whether they like cup it with their hands or if they like bend over and drink it like straight out of the pond or whatever. And so he tests them in this way. He says, all right, so depending on how they drink out of the water will determine who's going to stay. All right, and then we pick up here. Let's go ahead and just read that. So verse 5. So he brought the people down to the water, and the Lord said to Gideon, everyone who laps the water with his tongue as a dog laps, you shall set by himself. Likewise, everyone who kneels down to drink. So he's kind of divvying up how everyone drinks the water here. Verse 6, the number of those who lapped, putting their hands to their mouths, was 300 men, but all the rest of the people knelt down to drink the water. In verse 7, the Lord said to Gideon, with the 300 men who lapped, I will save you and give the Midianites into your hand, and let all the others go, every man to his home. From 32,000 people to 10,000, which that for me is a huge, drastic difference. And still God says, no, still too many. And he cuts it all the way down to 300 people. All right? God is wanting to make it explicitly clear who is about to win this victory. Okay? And so he cuts it all the way down to 300 people. And this brings up our last point, dealing with lack of faith. Is a lack of faith is only removed when God is in control. Okay? You lose that. The lack of faith is removed from your life when God steps in and God is in control. When you allow Him control of your life. Okay? You will not have confidence. You will not have peace. You will not have joy. You won't have any of that stuff if God is not in control. You're going to continue to doubt Him. You're going to continue to struggle. And you're going to continue to have this lacking faith. But when God steps in, He removes all doubt. There's no reason for you to question it. When God steps in and He does what He does best, you let Him do His thing, then there's no more reason to doubt. And He shows up here. And what happens if you continue to read the story? The Midianites are camping out, and God sends Gideon and the men to surround, and they're going out to defeat the Midianites with only a trumpet and like a pot. Okay. And again, 300 men with a trumpet and a pot compared to this gigantic army, the odds aren't fantastic. But what happens is he has them surround the camp, And he gives them the sign, he gives them the cue, and then Gideon and all the men start blowing their trumpets really loud and smashing the pots on the ground and stuff, making all this big ruckus. And what happens is the Midianites start freaking out, and they start turning on each other and start fighting each other and essentially killing themselves, right? And so God delivers Israel. God brings this victory without them even having to lift a sword. That's what's incredible, right? And again, he's making it very clear. There is no reason for you to doubt me, okay? I want to make it evident that I'm the one that brought this victory, okay? So we read the story, we look through this, and we just see time after time how God has proven himself to Gideon. He has shown up in Gideon's life. And yet Gideon still remains hesitant. He still remains uncertain and doubtful. And what's crazy is even after this incredible victory that God does in Gideon's life, that God uses Gideon in, Gideon will continue to go on, and his reputation is known of becoming very arrogant and full of himself. And he starts doing some really not so wise things. Even after all that God had done with him, how God has used him, that wasn't enough. And he still turned to his sin. He still turned to his pride and his own selfishness, right? And this brings the question this morning of how many times does God need to prove himself to you? How many times does God have to show up in your life in order for you to trust him? I'm speaking to me too, okay? But just think about that. How many times does God have to show up and prove himself to you in order for you to finally trust him? This makes me think of a family friend. Back when I was in high school, he's very lost. He was a very lost person and was really hooked on drinking and drugs and all this stuff. And in high school, I find out that his liver is failing, right? And if you know anything about that, that's not a very positive thing to happen, right? And you kind of need your liver, right? And so he was losing it, and it was going out, and he was, drastically, he lost all of this weight, and he was just literally on his deathbed. And they were struggling to find another liver to give him a transplant, to give him a new liver to save him, right? They were struggling to find one that matched what he needed. And me knowing this, I know that he's lost. I know without a doubt that this guy's lost. And I'm in the middle of my high school, I think it was like my English class or something that I'm sitting in. And I'm just so broken over this guy, knowing that he's on his last breath and he doesn't know Jesus. And so I text my youth minister, because again, I'm in school. It's not like I can just run up to the hospital and talk right now. So I text my youth minister and I say, hey, if you have a chance today, can you just run up there and just talk with him? Just kind of see what you can do, just talking to him and encouraging him. And so he does that because he's an awesome youth minister. And he went up there, and I'm going through school, and I get this text later on saying that this guy on his deathbed prayed to receive Christ. And so really encouraged by that. I was like, oh my gosh, that's incredible. And it was just such a peaceful moment because knowing that this guy he's right about to die. Like he's literally it's just a matter of time. And he gives his life to Christ, and that changes everything. And now we have this hope. Now he's got this eternity secure, and God has saved him, and that's just so incredible. But what's even cooler, what's more amazing about this story is against all odds, they were able to find another liver. And God steps in, and he gives him a new liver, essentially giving him a new life, right? Just picture of this new life. And there's no question that this was God. It was over. It was over. And yet God steps in and removes all of that doubt. He says, I've shown up in your life. And this should be a life-changing moment. If you've ever, I've never been in like a life or death situation, but when you get to that should be an eye-opening thing, I would imagine. And so his life is completely saved. And God steps in and does this incredible miracle. But when he goes home, and he recovers like crazy, like it's insane how fast he recovers. But when he goes home, over time, he slips right back into what he was doing before. He starts drinking again, which was half the reason he was in the hospital in the first place. And he starts doing that again. And he starts doing drugs again. And he starts doing this stuff, and where it puts him right back in the hospital all over again. And then he gets out of the hospital, again, miraculously shows up and gets out of the hospital, is saved from that. And then when he gets out of the hospital, over time, what happens? He goes to jail. He gets put in jail. And then he gets out of that. He gets out of jail, and then he gets hooked on the same stuff again. He starts losing his job. He starts doing all this stuff. And then and just recently, he just went back in jail again. And it just blows my mind as I'm looking at this guy's life, and I'm thinking, how many more times does God have to show up for you to get it? What else needs to happen for you to understand who God is and what He has done for you? What else needs to happen in order for you to trust Him with all of your life? It makes no sense. But we do this all the time. God proves Himself over and over. And that's the thing. God doesn't have to prove Himself more than that. He already has done that by sending Jesus. That was the ultimate way that He has proved His love and His faithfulness for you, is by sending Jesus. And that should be the only reason you need to trust Him and give your life to Him. And yet we still, just like Gideon, well, I don't really know, God. Let me just make sure this is what you want. Or I don't really want to trust you in this. In ways that we don't trust God in our lives. We don't trust Him with our money. We get in these tight places in our money, and believe me, I'm really figuring this out now as I'm paying for loans and stuff for school, and I'm getting in these tight places, and we don't trust Him with our money. We stop giving to the church, we start giving to Him and trusting Him with that because we're more confident in our money, right? We don't trust Him with our jobs. We don't trust Him with our families. We don't trust Him in our relationships, whether that means you're in a relationship that you know God doesn't want you to be in, or that you're in a relationship that's kind of rocky and you're wanting to bail, but God's saying be faithful in it. We don't trust Him in it, and we just run the other way. But ultimately, out of all of this, we still don't trust Him with all of our lives. We like to pick and choose the parts and pieces that we want to give to God without trusting Him with all of it. As we close, JT, if you can start making your way up here. One of my favorite verses in the Bible is Proverbs 3, 5 and 6. And it's one that has just really hit me pretty hard in some really difficult things when I'm having a lack of faith and I'm starting to doubt and I'm starting to struggle. And it says, trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not rely on your own understanding. Acknowledge Him in all of your ways and He will make your path straight. But the key to that is the first part. Trust in Him with all of your heart. Not just a little bit, with all of your heart. And do not rely on your own understanding. But that's what we do every day. We rely on what we know, what was familiar to us, what makes sense to us. We rely on our logic. And that's why we start doubting God. That's why we start losing this faith and trusting Him. It's because we're focused on what makes sense to us. But God's not going to work in ways that make sense to us a lot of times. He's going to ask us to do things that gets us out of our comfort zones. He's going to ask us and put us in these opportunities to where we have to trust Him. There's no other option. And the question this morning is, are you going to trust Him? Whether that means in the just situations that you're going through. Are you going to trust Him with your money? Even though it makes no sense to do that. You're looking at how much you have that's your tithe and what you need to survive. And are you going to trust Him in that? I trust that God is big, God is powerful, and He has proven Himself over and over and over again. Are you going to trust Him? Are you going to trust Him in your families? Are you going to trust Him in your relationships? But ultimately, are you going to trust Him with your life? And I'm speaking to the saved and the lost all together. Because every day we have this fight with God about who wants the throne of our heart. We like to be on the throne. We like to do things our way. Our pride gets in the way. And we like to be in control. But that's us relying on our own understanding. And when we get in those positions, of course we can't see God move in our lives. Of course, and we're not allowing Him to because we're in the way. Are you going to learn to trust Him? You're going to let go of control. Say, God, it makes no sense for me to do this. I like being in control and it's against everything in my nature to do this. But I'm going to trust You. Not because you're forcing me to, not because I feel obligated to, but because You have done so much for me. And You've done enough. That's the thing. God has done enough to prove His love to you, and yet He still, on a daily basis, proves His love for you. The fact that you're still breathing right now is once again how God is proving His faithfulness to you. Will you trust Him? But some of you in this room, you've never trusted Him. You've been running from Him for a long time. Because you think you know what you're doing. You think you've got it figured out. And you're just going to continue to be miserable. You're going to continue to be searching for answers in all of the wrong places. The question is, will you finally trust Him with your life. The Bible says we are all sinners. Every one of us are just as stupid as Gideon. Every one of us are guilty of sin, of doing things that go against what God wants for us. And because of that, Romans 6:23 says that we deserve to die and go to a place called hell. The punishment for our sin is death. That's separated from God forever. But God, once again, in Romans 5:8, proves His love to you. He shows how much you can trust Him by sending Jesus to die for you. And then He says, if you put your life into Jesus' hands, you trust Him, you make Him Lord. That means boss, ruler of your life. And you make Him Lord, then you will be saved from this punishment. And you'll begin to watch as He just completely transforms your life. And some of you in this room need to do that today. So if you could bow your heads and close your eyes. In a moment, we're going to sing this song. And again, there are many of you in this room who you've been in this place with God where you've just been really struggling to trust Him. And I encourage you this morning, come on your hands and knees on the altar up here and just show God, I trust you. Lord, this situation I'm in is scary. It is uncertain. And I have no idea how I'm going to get through it. But I have confidence in who you are. I have confidence in what you have done for me. And I want to trust you with all that I am. Come before Him this morning and make that known to Him. Some of you, again, have not trusted Him with your life, and you need to do that today. Come before us this morning. We got Pastor John up here. We'd love to talk with you. I would love to talk to you. Come up here and don't leave this room because you're scared of what other people think about you, because you're too scared to get out of your seat and come forward. God has proven Himself for you time and time again. No one else's opinion of you matters, right? His is the only one that matters. And don't let fear, don't let worrying about what other people think keep you from giving your life to Him. And so as we sing this last song, you come forward this morning. Say, I want to give Jesus control. I want to trust Him with my life. And when you put your life into His hands, you are trusting in someone who is sovereign. You are trusting in someone who is loving, who is faithful. Regardless of how messed up we can be, He is still faithful and still loves us and still desires a relationship with us. And I encourage you to trust Him with that this morning. Heavenly Father, Lord, we are very stubborn people. Lord, we get so caught up in our own little world, and it causes us to have a lack of faith. It causes us to doubt you, which, Lord, is insane because you have, time after time after time, you have proven yourself to be faithful. And Lord, I pray that we would trust you. God, it goes against our logic. It goes against our understanding. But when we trust you with all of our hearts, that's when we see you invade our lives and show up in a tremendous way. And I pray, God, that we would do that this morning. Whether that's for the first time, whether that's just being reminded of why we need to trust you, and that we would just make that commitment once again to you this morning. Lord, may we not let doubt, may we not let fear or worry keep us from you and from your very best for us, God. So I pray that we would surrender all that we are to you, Lord. Give you our hearts, give you our lives, give you all that we are, God, because it's yours. We pray this all in Jesus' name.